Hi and welcome to everybody. As you know, my name is Heather Blumenthal, and it's really wonderful to welcome you tonight. I believe that there is load shedding across different parts of South Africa. We are recording, so at least those who aren't able to make it will be able to watch the recording. The Forverts, or the Forverts in Yiddish, the largest Jewish newspaper in the world for many years, was founded in 1897 in New York City by a group of social immigrants from Eastern Europe. With the growing wave of Jewish immigrants to the USA in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, the Forward gained growing popularity and its circulation grew rapidly. And in the 20s and 30s, close to 300,000 people used to read the Forward. In the 21st century, the Forward is now a digital publication with online reporting and a large following. Our guest speaker for tonight, Chana Pollack, has been at the helm of the Forward's archives for over 20 years, providing research, translation, and production of original Forward archival content with an eye on contemporary context. It took 2 years for the Forward to first cover the 1941 massacre at Babyn Yar, a ravine in Ukraine, where the Nazis massacred more than 33,000 Jews over 2 days. Years after their initial report, their predecessors kept readers connected to Babyn Yar with witness accounts at a Nazi war crimes trial, a detailed history of the event of Kyiv Jews shared with the delegation of New York rabbis visiting in the 1950s, and dispatches from their Paris correspondents. With eyewitnesses to the atrocities largely gone, the Forward's back issues are an invaluable source, bearing witness to what we cannot even imagine. This walk through the highlights of that coverage, its content and its tone, may offer you a deeper understanding of events unfolding there in our time. At the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center, we understand only too well the importance of archival material. Our archive, housed at UCT as a special collection, contains numerous photographs, documents, artifacts relating to the Shoah, and is widely used by academic students and the public. Chana Pollack will, through archival resources, show her insights and research into her lecture for tonight, Cattle Grazed Among the Bones of Our Sacred Martyrs, covering Babyn Yar through the decades. Before we start, a reminder for everybody to switch off their cameras and sound. And if you have any questions for Chana, please place them in the Q&A or chat section at the bottom of your screen. It now gives me great pleasure to welcome Chana Pollack.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction, also explaining about the Forward. And I'm really thrilled to, thank you. My slides are just going up. I'm thrilled to be here. I guess one of the beautiful parts of the pandemic, we were just talking about that, is the ability to reach across oceans and just sort of be together in a moment electronically, even though I understand you're having electronic problems tonight. So with no further ado, I was tasked, like many of you, watching events unfold in Ukraine recently. In March of this year, you'll probably remember that the memorial, the memorial for Babyn Yar, was struck by a missile. I think the intention was to get let's believe the intention was really to get the public TV station, I believe, was across the broadcasting center, was across the road. And in any case, it really shook many, many people. And so my editor-in-chief, Jody Radurin of the Forward today, was curious, aside from us giving readers an opportunity to understand what was unfolding in real time, there's always, because we have an archive and because, God willing, next week we'll be celebrating 125 years, we've got reporting that goes pretty far back, starting in, like Heather said, in 1897. So I was asked to go back and take a look and see, well, how did the Forward actually report on Babyn Yar? And, if you hear that question, you might think, oh, sure, how did the Forward? Of course, we reported on the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. We were one of the first papers to be able to receive information and give our readership that information directly. We broke the news about concentration camp Treblinka directly from a source who had been imprisoned there. So you would expect, and if you know a little bit about our history, if you are a Forward reader, you'll know that events occurring specifically affecting the Jewish community, war or no war, the Forward was there. Revolution or no revolution, the Forward tended to be there. But here was a case where there was like a news blackout on so many levels. And you'll see that that's actually the arc of what I was able to find out about how the Forward covered the story of Babyn Yar. And as Heather just, read the introduction, Babyn Yar is considered the largest mass execution site of the Holocaust. And if, like me, I hail from the lovely Polish and Ukrainian Jews, I am not a Litvak. I understand I'm talking to a lot of Litvaks, but I am married to one. And I've met a lot of Litvaks on my journeys through Yiddish land. But if, like me, you were raised understanding the history of the Churban, as we say in Yiddish, the Holocaust, to have largely occurred, on Polish soil, it is really a leap in a way to go through Lithuania for sure with mass executions, but then to come to this story of Babyn Yar with officially the number is, slightly above 30,000 Jews were massacred in the course of a few days using, guns, using bullets, right? Taking place on the edges of a major city, Kyiv, in what was then Russian territory. It's kind of mind-blowing to understand that we don't know as much about it. And I understand very frustrating for many, many people who lost people there. It's been a source of some agony. So we were really proud and happy to, not happy, but we were honored, let's just say, with the task of trying to see, how did this story come to Jewish people? How did, the Forward was published, of course, for decades only in Yiddish. We're on our we're in our 20-something year of publishing in English and in Yiddish. But at that time, when the story broke in World War II, right, you would only have been able to know the information, you would think, only in Yiddish. But as it turns out, the massacre took place in 1941, and it took 2 years for the Forward to get word of it. And they were able to do that through the fact that the story broke because two war correspondents, one of the New York Herald and one of the New York Times, in 1943, when it was liberated, quote unquote, by the Soviets, they were actually allowed back in, and then the story kind of began to unfold. But as the kids would say, spoiler alert, if you march a little bit forward in history, right, as soon as World War II ends, like pretty much on the heels of World War II ending, comes the Cold War, which, virtually and technologically, and of course, media-wise, a wall is erected between the West and, what was then considered the East, the Russia. So then more information was not available. Although you'll hear in what I'm going to tell you that the Soviets did, of course, have a crimes investigation committee. It wasn't part of the Nuremberg trials that the West was organizing. This was their own investigation, and thereby some witnessing of Babyn Yar came to be known, and that was it. Then the story was cut off. Why? Spoiler alert, I'm sure, if you know some of the politics of the past century, under the Cold War, there was tremendous oppression of Jews in Soviet countries, and also an official story of who were the victims of the Holocaust. You weren't allowed to call out and to ask for recognition of how vastly the Jews suffered was considered to be like, a cosmopolitan nationalist. That information was not allowed to be talked about. So that's some of what we're going to see here. And I just want to say the slide up on the screen that we're looking at right now, in 1961, So the story begins in, like, it happens in 41. In 43, we actually get the information and we publish our first story. And then in the 50s, a couple more stories kind of come out that Heather mentioned. A group of rabbis go and travel, and they're, given information by Jews who have survived the war and come back to Kyiv, and so on and so forth. Little bits of information come out, but that's it. Then there's a total news blackout until, I'm sure a lot of you remember this, in 1961, a Soviet poet, not Jewish, Yevgeny Yevtushenko, writes a poem called Babyn Yar, and he calls out his fellow countrymen for not acknowledging the suffering of Jews that happened at Babyn Yar. And more importantly, or just as important, something we're still talking about today, where is the official memorial of Babyn Yar? So this poem just blew the minds of the forward, and I'll go through a few slides later and we'll read some excerpts of the poem. But let's go back to 43. So the forward had a correspondent named Avram Leib Hendon. He was, for the most part, our economic and political reporter. This, of course, let's remember, it's going on all in Yiddish. And he was tasked with the writing. Just a little bit about him. Hendon was actually born in Ukraine, like a lot of our original generation of writers for the forward, for that first 3/4 of that 20th century. That was, those were our writers and our editors, and of course, a lot of our readership. Yes, immigrants to the United States, but their origins, their roots were in Eastern Europe, and their mother tongue was, for the most part, Yiddish. And they were committed to Yiddish as a lingua franca of the Jewish people. So they wrote in Yiddish, and they reported in Yiddish, and they investigated in Yiddish. Hendon himself, interestingly enough, immigrated to America and settled in Baltimore. He was from a fairly well-to-do family. His father is noted as having been a lawyer, whatever the form that took place in Soviet early pre-revolutionary Russia. So he was able to get an education, and when he arrived in Baltimore, he became a dentist. So this story that the forward published of Babyn Yar was actually written and gathered. The news information was gathered by somebody who was a Yiddish journalist, yes, twice elected president of the IL Parrots, the Yiddish Writers Union, and even in the 50s had traveled to Israel to try and establish a world union of Jewish journalists. I don't know if that ever actually occurred, but Hendon himself professionally was trained as a dentist. So I just think that's kind of interesting. So the 1943 piece that he published was cited the work of two American correspondents who were actually permitted by the Soviets to access what was then known as the killing fields, right? Their names were Morris Hindis from the New York Tribune, and W.H. Lawrence of the New York Times. And both those reporters are fairly well known. And you can see, not just for breaking this story, if you go and just do a search on Wikipedia, you can read more about them. And the fact, though, that the forward aggregated news from the outside, but then the interlocutor, right, the person who's transmitting that information to the Jewish reader is himself Jewish and is himself a Yiddish speaker, and you'll see in a way that makes all the difference. And many of the readers, right, they're actually reading about accounts of their murdered relatives in this massacre. They're learning about it for the first time through this report by Hendon. So here's a little bit I've selected out of his report. It would seem we've all become accustomed, and this is my translation. He wrote in Yiddish and I'm providing the English translation. It would seem we've all become accustomed to the hideous nature of the Nazis. This is our 43, right? So the war is not quite over yet. And there is news that is known about what's transpiring. The last tragic chapter of Jewish martyrology, the Warsaw Ghetto, is still fresh in our minds. Each of us has had their hair stand on end more than once. Our blood has frozen in our veins, reading of the news, now confirmed, that the Nazis poisoned Jews with lethal gas in order to save on bullets. Truthfully, were we able to take it all in deeply, we'd go out of our minds. So he's very interesting opening paragraph where he's about to tell you something just as hideous, if not more. But as it happens, this is Hendon, we've not heard it all. There's more to receive. The curtain on the Jewish tragedy will still be rising after the war. The civilized world will witness that the Jews paid the highest price during this war. A number of American correspondents over the last few days have arrived in Kyiv. It's the first time American correspondents have been here since the Red Army took Kyiv. They all sent back reports with ghastly details about Kyiv's tragedy and the mass murder the Nazis led against the Jews. As it happens, this is the worst tragedy that we've yet listened to, perhaps even noted at all, with the possible exception of the Warsaw Ghetto. And what he's talking about is the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, of course, and it's a really great time to actually bring that up and to see how he's connecting the two, because April 19th, I'm sure most of you know, the opening nights of Pesach are traditionally in Yiddish land, Yiddish cultural institutions and members and Yiddish speakers. We traditionally commemorate April 19th as the beginning of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. It's a very sacred time in Yiddish culture. So here's Hendon again. So he's referring to that. He's letting people know that, you've read about that in this paper, and now I'm going to tell you something equally horrendous. So here's Hendon. The two acclaimed American correspondents, Morris Hindus of the New York Herald Tribune and W.H. Lawrence of the New York Times, sent detailed accounts from Kyiv. Their reports are a foundational investigation into terrifying acts the Nazis have perpetrated in Kyiv, and their reporting was corroborated by eyewitnesses who saw the tragedy. And now here is a section I would say is, what makes the Forward special, even when they're aggregating or borrowing news or translating news from outside sources. He himself, right, having been born in Ukraine, it turns out spent time in Kyiv. So he's letting the readers know, what is Kyiv? Something which today, too, if you read the reporting, I mean, it's crazy. I could be telling you, it feels like I could be telling you what we're reporting today about what's going on in Kyiv. I'm sure, you all know. But, and here's what happens when somebody tries to tell you, what is Kyiv? Why is Kyiv so here is somebody who spent time there telling you. Kyiv was considered among Russia's most beautiful cities. The writer of these lines, that's Hendon, knows the city well. I spent over a year there. Aside from its magnificent streets, Kyiv is replete with nature's wonders due to being built on 6 mountains. And just as the Hudson flows at the banks of the island of Manhattan, so the glorious Dnieper River flows at the edge of Kyiv, lending the city much charm. One can imagine the majority of residents escaped, but it's also rapidly becoming apparent that the majority of the 70,000 who remained lived in cellars and didn't see the light of day for months. When the Red Army entered the city, it met a skeletal-looking starving population. It was frightening to look at them. So that's the general population of what it looked like when they entered. Prior to the war, says Hendon, about 100,000 Jews lived in Kyiv. There remain a few Jews in Kyiv who can be counted on the fingers of one hand. The American correspondents were quite curious to uncover the details of the Nazi-led mass murder of Kyiv's Jews. They talked to a few people and heard a myriad of tales, but couldn't fathom how the slaughter took place. The real information was given the correspondents by the Soviet Investigating Commission into the Nazi atrocities. Pavel Alyoshin, a Kyiv architect, is a witness. He stated that in September 1941, 9 days after the Nazis captured Kyiv, they ordered all Jews to report in the Lukyanovka district. That area of Kyiv is well known to everyone. Alyoshin told the investigating commission that Kyiv's Jews didn't know the terrifying fate that awaited them. They thought they were called to gather there because the Nazis wished to evacuate the Jews from Kyiv. But when they gathered at the designated location near Babyn Yar, a vast ravine in the region, Nazi soldiers shot them all. They then ordered Soviet prisoners of war to dump the corpses in the Babyn ravine. Alyoshin stated that he himself didn't witness these events, but he said everyone in Kyiv knew about it. And he had spoken to several people who provided the details. So what's interesting in that passage is to note that when an individual transmits a witnessing, it's sort of pushed back by the official Soviet account. So, that's part of the trouble of the news blackout that I spoke about earlier. But still, here he goes. That same Soviet investigating commission produced 3 military prisoners of war who had managed to escape from the Nazi concentration camp. The 3 Jews are Ephraim Vilkis, an Odessa native, a splendid, well-built, handsome youth of 33, Leonid Ostrovsky, who is 31, and Vladimir Davidov, 28. So again, just to consider, if you're reading the forward, you're reading this account, those 3 people, Maybe they were your relatives. These 3 Jewish POWs didn't witness the slaughter, but witnessed how the Nazis, prior to leaving Kiev several months ago, exhumed Jewish corpses in Babyn Yar and with a variety of chemicals burned them all in order to eliminate all traces of the hideous mass slaughters. The witnesses told how the fire was so terrifying and the chemicals so intensive that even the bones of the corpses disintegrated entirely. The Nazis mostly seemed not to want the Russians to be able to gather any knowledge of the crime. Vilklas, himself a former Nazi POW, told of how on August 14th, 1943, his POW camp received 100 new prisoners of war. Together with others, they were led to Babyn Yar and ordered to exhume the ravine where Jewish corpses were to be found. Bodies of the Jewish martyrs were cremated over 3 days. By chance, in the middle of the night, the 3 Jewish prisoners of war were able to escape. Prior to their escape, Vilklas told the commission he saw the Nazis bring a few hundred more prisoners of war to complete the job. He also saw them make a new fire, and he realized that that fire would probably be used to incinerate them as well, so that no evidence of the crime would remain. There remains no undamaged street in Kiev, this is 43. Wherever one walks or stands, one sees the murderous hands of the Nazis. As it turns out, though, it's not that simple to completely wreck such a large city. Morris Hindus notes that despite the vast destruction here and there, one can find signs of a city's beauty. An elderly Russian professor from Kiev quite rightly remarked to Hindus that buildings can be repaired, destruction can be set to rights, but tens of thousands of people's, their lives cannot be recovered. So that's the first report that came out in the forward. And years after this initial report, forward writers kept readers connected to Babyn Yar, including a detailed history of the event that Kyiv Jews themselves transmitted to a group of New York rabbis visiting in the 50s, and dispatches from a Paris correspondent of ours named Leon Lenin, some of you might be familiar with. In 43, this is 3 years after the mass murder, the Forverts offered a special report, came out in the Shabbos edition, about the beginning of the Kiev trials of the Nazi perpetrators, and there they named the individual, somebody named Heinrich Marquardt, and they talked about how vicious this individual was, and they gave voice in that article. The writer gave voice to somebody named Jenya Einhorn, who was indicated that she was a survivor of Babyn Yar. They're very few, so it's rare to actually have an eyewitnessing. And she, of course, described the horrors. He opened his paragraph by giving her witness, saying, "I've witnessed eyes gouged out and hacked off human hands." And she was one of the few Jewish women survivors, and she also she testified against German police battalions were used to do this. But I should also, and I'm sure folks know, that in 43, they didn't report this, but we know today that Ukrainian police also took place, and Ukrainian collaborators. So that's, that brings us to sort of this moment in time when we're thinking about the current bombing of the monument, and, Ukrainians suffering at the hands of the Russian brutality. And it's quite an interesting mix of history for the Jewish reader to encounter even today. And then, so that's, let's say that gives us a flavor of what came out sort of shortly right after. And now if we leap ahead, at 56, a small item appeared, so not on the front page, not a major breaking story, and it said, "Russian Jews beseech American Jews not to forget them." So this was the travel reportage of a Rabbi, Israel Movshevitz, who was part of the New York Board of Rabbis, and he was able, it's kind of early to be able to do these kind of trips. In 56, he was able to go officially to the Soviet Union, and this is what he wrote. "We traveled to Babyn Yar, and on the way there, we passed the old Jewish cemetery. There we met 3 Jewish elders we invited to join us. They shared their story of the massacre. And his were among the first post-Holocaust ones that the Forward published. He describes Babyn Yar. Babyn Yar is a ravine 3 miles long, 30 feet deep. There, Nazis shot, and he gave this number, 160,000 Kyiv Jews. They were killed, doused with gasoline, and burnt, after which 2 inches of earth was shoveled over them. Jews returning to Kiev after Nazi deportation found piles of corpses and human hair strewn across the pit. Cattle grazed among the bones of our sacred martyrs. So there we begin to get the story as it's held by Soviet Jews at this point who returned after deportation by the Nazis. They returned and they stayed. We know that from today's news that there's a pretty big, fairly substantial Ukrainian Jewish community. And we know that, of course, because the president is at this point is Jewish. So imagine though it's 56 and that's not the case. So the few Jews who came back and started to rebuild the community are actually able to transmit information verbally. And this is information that's never been published before. And so what you see, though, is the beginning of the American Jewish community or the Western Jewish community becoming aware of what life is like for Soviet Jews, definitely, under Stalin, but even now, coming up under Khrushchev, that events, they're not having the kind of life that you would want, especially for survivors of the war. And the community is becoming aware of it and they're starting to discuss it publicly. So by 58, with the Cold War, American Jews are definitely becoming, rapidly upwardly mobile. And the Forward starts to talk about their frustration that the Soviet Union is refusing to memorialize Babyn Yar. And here they borrow news from the London Jewish Observer. And it's important to recognize that the fact of the Forward being based in New York is it is what it's tremendous. But it did become, as Heather mentioned, by the 1920s, it had a circulation of 250,000, had 250,000 circulation for a Yiddish paper that's like unheard of. We're still pretty much the last Yiddish paper standing. We remain an independent Jewish media organization. That's also unusual, but we also reached across the globe. So that meant when we couldn't get reporters into certain places, we would take news from the closest source. In this case, it was London's Jewish Observer. So in 58, the Forward aggregates news from the London Jewish Observer and again, reports, this is one of World War II's worst Nazi slaughters. And then they tell the news that the Kyiv City Council had actually voted to commemorate the murdered Jews. But they also reported that Moscow had overridden that decision. And perhaps most importantly, for the first time, the article says Ukrainians participated along with the Nazis. And then they concluded, amazingly, that Moscow has other construction plans for that area, if you can imagine. So now to our slides. By the 60s, right, I'm sure in South Africa too, there is a youth culture. It's taking hold all over the world. And that's what brought, I would like to think, the concept of Babyn Yar again to the public consciousness through the Forward. And what happens? The first slide that I just showed was the poem Babyn Yar by Yevgeny Yevtushenko breaks loose, it's published, and the Forward grabs it, translates it into Yiddish, and wham, it's up on the front page. The Forwards initially described Yevtushenko's public reading of the poem in Moscow as having been very well received, but then the real news came through. And they understood that the poet's heroic act was the fact that in this poem, and we'll shortly read an excerpt of it, and you'll see, he has this incredible line where he's calling on Russians to recognize anti-Semitism. And he says, when the last anti-Semite on earth is buried, then maybe maybe communism will triumph then. But until you recognize what happened and you're honest about it, this is all a sham. And in Yiddish, the line is, Wenn Svet auf ewig schon begraben werden, der Letzte auf der Erde antisemit. So let's just take a second and read just an excerpt of his poem that you can see up on the page. No monument stands over Babyn Yar. A drop sheer as a crude gravestone. I am afraid. Today I am as old in years as all the Jewish people. Oh, my Russian people, I know you are international to the core, but those with unclean hands have often made a jingle of your purest name. I know the goodness of my land, how vile these anti-Semites, without a qualm, they pompously called themselves the Union of the Russian people. The wild grasses rustle over Babyn Yar. The trees look ominous like judges. Here, all things scream silently, and bearing my head slowly, I feel myself turning gray, and I myself am one massive, soundless scream above the thousand buried here. I am each old man here shot dead. I am every child here shot dead. Nothing in me shall ever forget. The Internationale let it thunder when the last anti-Semite on earth is buried forever. In my blood, there is no Jewish blood. In their callous rage, all anti-Semites must hate me now as a Jew. For that reason, I am a true Russian. So let's go to the next slide. Thank you. And I just want to quickly just show you. So that was it. The forward grabbed it and began trying to explain to a new generation coming up that maybe wasn't even native Yiddish speakers. They're getting the news through their parents. They're starting to read the forward, you know, the boomer generation. They're starting to tell them, look what just happened. A Soviet poet, he's not Jewish, and he just risked his life. And he put out a poem calling on the anti-Semitism and reminding us what happened at Babyn Yar and that there's still no memorial and no one will say how many Jews were actually murdered there and that they suffered the most. So here you can go. This is the slide now says, you know, poem about anti-Semitism is a sensation is in Russia. Next slide. Junger sowjetische Dichter scharf kritikiert in Moskwa verliert gegen Antisemitism. So now the news is starting to come out. Young Soviet writer is sharply criticized in Moscow for his poem against anti-Semitism. Next slide. And this is like day after day in the forward. And the issue was so interesting and of note that a Yiddish poet, Yankov Glatstein, very, very well-known Yiddish poet, literary critic, Glatstein held a symposium on the forward used to have a radio station called WEBG, and they held a symposium there about the poem Babyn Yar. Next slide. And this is just like a total article about what was going on with Evgeny Yevtushenko since he published the poem. So they started being concerned about him and looking into who he was. Why would he do this? Next slide. And then the poem, when it first came out, it was a kind of interesting newspaper thing. When it first came out, an excerpt, right, was published. It translated in Yiddish very quickly by a poet that we haven't been able to identify with the initials Nun Yud, and it was put in the article on the front page. A couple of days later, at that point, a fairly well-known Yosef Rubinstein Yiddish poet, he did his own translation. He's like, yeah, I'm not having that other one. And so the poem is again published in the forward. This is like a week later after it comes on the scene, and it's published on an important page. You can see on the right side, you see in English our sort of our masthead, and beneath it, that's always where the editorial goes. So if you're on that page, it's a fairly critical article. It's judged to be of import. And here it is, the entire story of Babyn Yar with the poem there. So like the forward is recognizing that at that point, they have to educate a new generation about the event. They may not know of it. And like I mentioned before, more information was available about what transpired in Lithuania for sure, but also in the camps that were on Polish ground for the most part. That was available, but the information of events that transpired under what was now the USSR, practically a news blackout, very difficult to find out. Next slide. And here, very interestingly, the forward is following that the poem is now spreading across the Soviet satellite countries. So this headline says Babyn Yar, in quotes, meaning the poem, verspreit in Poland, meaning it's spreading, it's headed to Poland. They're picking up on it. This is like, very intensive kind of a poem being a harbinger of other liberatory forces. And so you see where discussing anti-Semitism is something that the intellectual artists, intellectuals in Soviet satellite countries are grabbing onto in order also to establish their own freedoms and rights. Next slide. And here, Soviet Jugendzeitung attackiert Yevtushenko für seine Sympathie mit jüdischen Cowboyness. Okay, so here now, back to the Soviets are now going to attack Yevtushenko. He's getting way too much attention in America, and they're well aware that the attention that they're getting, in part because of Jewish voices like the Forward, is to demand a memorial and to demand better treatment of Soviet Jews. So here, what happened in Russia was actually that an anti-Yevtushenko poet, a lesser poet by all means, from what I've read, comes out in a youth journal and publishes a mocking poem of Yevtushenko, and he's attacking him for sympathizing and calling out the fact of Jewish victims specifically. Next slide. And then the Forward realizes again that, okay, now we really have to kind of educate our readers because we have a new generation coming up. And also the story is not that well known. We had this one story by Hendon in 43. We had a little bit about, right, the trial, but we don't actually have that much historical information. Let's see what we can do. And so they put, this is an advertisement in the paper itself about, you know, coming attraction, so to speak, in which they're telling, read the Sunday Forward, our guy, Leon Leneman, he's going to give you all the details about the slaughter at Babyn Yar. So they're using the Yevtushenko event to also, like, you know, get as much information to the readership as possible to educate the Jewish community about what actually transpired under lands that are now back under Soviet hands. Next slide. And here, finally, with enough push in the later years of the 60s and the 70s, Russia opened a contest to invite artists to pitch for a memorial of Babyn Yar. And of course, that really took a lot longer, but this is one of the early sort of admissions that they were like aware of what the West was saying. Next slide. Okay, so I'm just gonna go through a little bit more of what we kind of wrote about it. And this is a little bit of after Yevtushenko is, you know, the symposium takes place, and then there's another editorial in the Forward. At this point, the Forward's editor is Moshe Kristal, and he decried publicly Russia's dishonest attitude towards equal rights for its own minorities and Jews specifically. So this is like a public declaration in which he says, and we could apply this to today as well. It's just like uncanny and very, very sad. But this is back in the 50s. He says, it's remarkable, sorry, in the 60s, he says, it's remarkable how difficult it is to chase down a lie, is what he had to say back in the 60s about Russian aggressive nationalism and its denial of its official anti-Semitism. And when, by the time you get to the Lenin report in, you know, a couple of days later, Leon Leneman, for those of you who don't know, he had been the Forward's correspondent in Europe, and on the heels of World War II, he was based in Paris. He was sent over to Warsaw to actually interview deported Jewish refugees who had arrived in Poland after being deported and exiled from Germany. And so they asked him again, this is also in the 60s, and he writes the entire history of the Babyn Yar massacre, in which he told readers that Khrushchev promised to erect a memorial and promptly forgot. And here's Leneman describing, again, through transmitted information, he wasn't there on the site, but what it was like when Khrushchev actually visited the site after its liberation. While Khrushchev was at the death pit of Babyn Yar, one could still recognize traces of the cruel bestial slaughter, he wrote. Beneath fresh, hastily scattered loose earth, even now one could see victims' limbs protruding. According to Lenin, Khrushchev was saddened by the sight, and he committed on the spot that the Soviet regime would ensure a monument to the memory of the slaughter, but that never happened. The official Soviet party line never referenced Jewish victims. Another Khrushchev anecdote that the Forward reported was from 1961. We had an Israeli correspondent, very famous writer named Sholem Rosenfeld. You can also read about him in Wikipedia. He described a 1943 visit that Khrushchev made to Babyn Yar when he was Ukraine's Communist Party secretary and a Soviet lieutenant general based in the newly liberated Kyiv. Rosenfeld, like Lenin, reported that Khrushchev had then given a stormy speech acknowledging the Jewish victims and swearing a monument would be erected in their memory. It would be like amazing to actually be able to access that speech and to find it. Lenin also mentioned an anonymous letter that the Israeli press had used, Davar, one of, Mariv, Davar, Yediot Achronot, some of the major presses in Israel, Davar's and no longer with us, but they had received a letter that they published describing Kyiv Jews actually making pilgrimages on Yom Kippur to visit the site to memorialize their martyrs. And they did so under fear of Soviet secret police. So they were, the Western Jewish community was picking up on actions that the Soviet Jewish community was doing and trying to help them, and also at the same time to create a proper reciting and knowledge of the history of the genocide that took place over there. And then some weird stuff started to happen. In 1961, construction to fill the site began as a part of an expansion of the town center. Lenin reported on the catastrophes that befell the engineers as they struck ground. And this is Lenin. A large plot of earth collapsed, tearing up entire streets, and over 100 Ukrainian lives were lost. The population, according to Moscow, began to panic, thinking the souls at Babyn Yar were taking revenge for Ukrainian collaboration and for bringing cattle to graze at the site of the mass graves. Days later was when we republished the Yevtushenko poem that the other translator, Yosef Rubinstein, redid, and so we kept it in the public eye. By the 25th anniversary of the massacre in 1966, again, the poem was brought out in an editorial, this time condemning anti-Semitism. And here's a quote. Recently, an American journalist has visited and described how masses of tourists visit Babyn Yar, it said, and yet no historical signage exists to signify what occurred here 25 years ago. And then a young Soviet writer, Anatoly Kuznetsov, he was 14 at the time of Babyn Yar, and he was so freaked out and blown away. And also he was a child of a teacher. He was an intellectual, and he began a notebook at 14 that eventually becomes his novel in the late 60s. It's published in the Soviet youth journal, but highly censored. And it pisses him off so much that he takes his writing and he managed to photograph it, and he sneaks himself and the writing out and seeks asylum in London. And so by 1970, it is finally published in English. This is my copy. I'm currently reading it. I highly recommend it. It's giving me so much insight on what is going on there now in terms of both the Soviet and the fascist mentality and what happened to the Jews under it and the Ukrainians. It's incredible that he managed to do this. In 1970, the Forwards wrote an editorial devoted to him and cited him as protecting the defamation of Babyn Yar's victims, that he was aghast about it. And so jumping ahead again, the next time we see it talked about in the Forward, by 1973, we had a news editor, Baruch Fenster, and he actually reported, and now it's in New York City, and there's enough of a groundswell of energy for Soviet Jewry action to get the city of New York to actually dedicate 10 days at City Hall in downtown Manhattan to be dedicated to Babyn Yar and to information about Babyn Yar, and also obviously to the plight of Soviet Jews. So at that point, there's an official declaration by the Mayor Lindsay, and then by 1976, the Forward's probably the final editorial until this year about Soviet defilement of the site And the editors point out that Jews have been gathering at Babyn Yar at each memorial date. They're taking their lives in their hands under Soviet system of governance, and they're going out there to where the sacred memory of their parents, their siblings, their friends. And the editorial called these pilgrimages a significant protest against Hitler's fascist murders and a reminder for the Jewish people, as well as all humanity, to never forgive and never forget. So I just want to end by, ironically, when I was researching this, I came across a 1934, that's the slide we're looking at now, is a 1934 ad in the foreword that you can send. Manischewitz is the brand of matzah. It's a big deal in the United States. Schickt auf Pesach Manischewitz matzahs zu eurer Kyiv in Russland for $5. For those of you who don't understand Yiddish, there's an ad from the 30s when we know that Ukraine under Stalin was experiencing an unbelievable famine that was government induced for the most part, and it was brutal, and millions of them died, and it was called the Holodomor. And the foreword was offering readers to send matzah to Russia, to your family in Russia, for $5. So I just thought that was incredibly impactful. And I just want to end with, can we get the next slide? Thank you. And I'm just going to end with a taste of the Anatoly Kuznetsov novel document of Babyn Yar that really got me when he was just aghast and thinking about human nature and how this could have happened and then been suppressed. How many thousands of years, this is Kuznetsov, has the human race been living on the earth and people still don't know how to share things? If only there was something worthwhile sharing. But in fact, one beggar would hang out his old socks to dry and another beggar would come along and murder him for the sake of those socks. Can it really be true that the only thing people have learned to do to perfection in the whole of their history is to murder each other? So with that, I thank you so much. Thank you for your attentions and for being interested in this story. And I wish you Aziz and a sweet Pesach, we would say in Yiddish, Aziz and Pesach. And bearing in mind that there are many, many people on a journey, an exodus today, as we're speaking here. And I want to thank you for joining us, especially in our 125th year anniversary for the Forward. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Chana. Wow, that was a lot of information and quite mind-boggling of how the journalists managed to get all the information that they did. And if they didn't get that information, we actually wouldn't know the story. I was quite interested about the poet who wrote the poem on anti-Semitism as a non-Jew. How did he manage to get away with it? I mean, surely the government must have done something to him, because nobody in the Soviet Union was allowed to talk about anything that was untoward.
Yes, that is such a great question, Heather. Thank you. I think a couple of things. I don't know. I'm not like an expert on Soviet systems by any means, although I like to think that I learned a lot doing this. But a couple of things. One, I'm sure, a lot of us are aware that when the Soviet Union needed to what's called a thaw, to create a thaw, right, in its system, it would, not because it was so, we would say in Yiddish, breithartzig, not because it was so generous, but because it's exactly what's going on today. If they need something, they're going to pivot towards the West. So I believe, and a couple of things too, I really believe in the power of the people. I think that's evidence in the fact of this Yiddish newspaper still being around and in us talking today. And the Jewish people have a tremendous, tremendous historical sensibility. And we have been, even under crushing circumstances, somehow saving historical documents and information and recording it, right? We know that from Holocaust testimonies, like Emanuel Ringelblum of the Warsaw Ghetto, right? He was an archivist in the ghetto, and we know it from, what's called the paper brigade, the Papierende Brigada, that Avram Sutzkever, famous Yiddish poet, right, in the Vilna ghetto, he was tasked with establishing a Nazi museum about Jews, but really he was hiding documents and saved, and that's how we have a lot of information today. So let's just say that the human spirit, even under communism, under fascism, apartheid, right? It can come through with what it knows is right and take great risks. So I think that's partly what happened with Yevtushenko. And I think also the world at that time, I tried to talk about it in the article, like this whole baby boom generation is coming of age, and it's like nothing the world has ever experienced before. The mores of the 50s are like just being shattered, right? And I think that energy took hold in Russia too. I've heard of great jazz being created then. Like jazz was not, they were supposed to be classical musicians. It wasn't, I mean, they are amazing jazz musicians now, but it was a revolutionary thing under communism. So there was a lot of energy in the world in general, and that's my non-scientific term, a lot of energy. And I think also that the Soviet Union was at a point where it was seeing that there was a young generation coming of age, and if they wanted to hold on to them, they thawed a little bit. But I also believe there was a lot of politics behind it, because the Cold War, the space race, a lot of stuff going on. I think they wanted to appear more attractive than they were at that point. I don't know, just some ideas.
And, I think that also when you look at a lot of the monuments that have been, or memorials that have been built in a lot of the areas in Eastern Europe, really speak to the Russians, the Russians that had died, and there's very little that is actually spoken about the Jews who perished.
Yes.
I think you have the change now that is starting to happen, where you are now having memorials that are dedicated to Jews, and you're seeing that happening now. But Carol, there's a question here. When was the photograph used to advertise your talk taken, and where is the ravine relative to this photograph?
Oh, that is the ravine. You are looking at it. You're from like a prominent, from like a hillock, and what you're looking at, I think, are two they must be Ukrainian Gentile women and a Nazi officer. He is overseeing the burning and the burying, not the actual execution. I believe this is like after, when they're having the POWs burn whatever remains were buried. They wanted to hide the crime. I think that's when the photo was taken, and I was permitted to use it by, I think it's in the public domain. Sorry, it was in the public domain. And what was the other question? What was the other part of it?
Okay, where is the ravine relative to this photograph?
Okay, so that is actually the ravine. Oh, this is what I wanted to say. Sorry, I gave a link in the chat. There's an incredible article that is sort of all the information that you want to know about Babyn Yar now. It's written by Masha Gessen, you may have heard of, tremendous journalist. She's Jewish. She's originally from the Soviet Union. She had to leave. She's a member of the LGBTQ Jewish community, and she's a tremendous journalist. And she went back and she just wrote about all the trials and tribulations with Putin, some of the gentlemen, the oligarchs who are funding the current Babyn Yar memorial, and all the madness, inherent with what is going on. Yeah, it's a great article, and I put the link in the chat for you.
Okay, so then from somebody anonymous, can you repeat the name of the young Jewish boy who wrote and had it published in England, also the title of the book?
Oh,
and if you
right.
could put that into the chat.
Absolutely. Yes, I'm happy to have fellow readers on my journey.
Okay.
We should do a book club for Babyn Yar.
Okay, so we have a question here from Charles de Villiers. Did Forward report on the Roma Soviet POWs and Ukrainian murdered at Babyn Yar?
Really great question. As you can see, it was like impossible. There was like a news blackout. So I think the Forward's first priority was, of course, trying to find out about Jewish victims. But I think in general, and that's really what made the news. If you read the English reporting from the Times and the Herald reporter too, but it's because it was such a mass of of a Jewish population to be executed in bullet by bullet in like 2 or 3 days. It was crazy. It was like the biggest mass execution of Jews that took place in the Holocaust. And that's saying a lot because there were a lot of those. So I think I'm going to say that our primary audience at the time would be Yiddish readers. So, okay, but not to say, because if you read the Kuznetsov, he writes about all population groups, but really it was such a mass of Jewish people. It escaped, nobody who saw it escaped that information. That was clear, that population group specifically, and the other ones were smaller. So it was, I hate to say it, but it was like, they were the big amount. Yeah. I hope that helps.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Chana. It's been a wonderful, wonderful and interesting talk. For those of our viewers who don't know the Forward, I've been reading the Forward for many years. It's a very, very interesting newspaper. I would suggest that you sign up and you can get there. They have daily news that comes through, weekly news. Very interesting. But Chana, thank you so much. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing of the archives of the Forward. And to our audience, thank you very much. Be well and look after yourself.
Thank you. Have a sweet Pesach.
Chag Sameach Pesach. Chag Pesach Sameach to everybody.